4 separate warning systems on 4 separate continents, activated within the same 72-hour window. Not next month, not last year. Right now, as you're watching this, a tsunami advisory triggered off the coast of Japan after the ground tore open beneath Kyushu. A Category 5 super typhoon, one of the strongest ever recorded this close to the international dateline, is bearing down on the East China Sea. A particularly dangerous situation wildfire warning, the highest level the National Weather Service issues, is active right now across 4 American states. And in Europe, a heat dome is locking 40-plus degree temperatures over an entire continent for the 4th time this summer. 4 different hazards, 4 different corners of the planet, 4 early warning systems, all lit up simultaneously. Today we're going to walk through exactly what triggered each one, what the real numbers are behind the headlines, and whether this is actually as unusual as it sounds, or something the planet does more often than people realize. No dramatizing, no doom, just the facts as they stand right now. If you want to stay current on stories like this as they develop, subscribe and turn on notifications, because every one of these 4 situations is still active. A thumbs up helps this reach more people who need accurate information instead of panic. Let's get into it. Let's start in Japan, because this is the most immediate and the most human of the 4. On July 28, 2026, at 4:27 in the afternoon local time, the ground beneath Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu ruptured violently. The Japan Meteorological Agency measured the earthquake at magnitude 7.1, with a depth of around 10 to 16 kilometers, shallow enough that almost all of the seismic energy hit the surface directly. In the towns of Uki City and Hikawa, the shaking registered Shindo 7, the absolute maximum level on Japan's seismic intensity scale, a scale specifically designed to describe what people and structures actually experience on the ground, rather than just the raw energy released. Kumamoto City itself, along with Yatsushiro, Uto, and Mashiki, registered Shindo 6 upper, still catastrophic shaking by any global standard. Within 2 minutes of the quake, the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a tsunami advisory for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, the narrow coastal waters bordering the affected region. That advisory stayed active for roughly 90 minutes before being lifted, once monitoring stations confirmed wave heights remained minor. But the earthquake damage itself was severe and immediate. In the town of Kashima, the second floor of a large shopping center collapsed following what witnesses described as an explosion and rising smoke, trapping dozens of employees and shoppers inside. Emergency crews spent days working through the wreckage. A factory chimney toppled elsewhere in the prefecture. Homes throughout the region were flattened. As of the most recent reporting, the confirmed death toll had climbed to at least 34, with search and rescue operations continuing into a 4th day, and authorities still working to determine how many people remained missing. What makes this earthquake particularly significant to seismologists is the location. Kumamoto sits along Japan's median tectonic line, the country's longest fault system, at a point where it forks into the Futagawa-Hinagu fault zone. This is not unfamiliar territory. In April 2016, a nearly identical sequence of earthquakes struck the same prefecture and killed 273 people. The Japan Meteorological Agency has publicly noted that the seismic pattern from this 2026 event resembles that 2016 sequence closely enough that officials are urging residents to stay alert for continued strong aftershocks in the days ahead. Japan's Prime Minister confirmed that the self-defense forces have been deployed for rescue operations, and the government has separately had to issue warnings about false information spreading online in the aftermath. A reminder that in the middle of a disaster, misinformation becomes its own hazard. Now let's move from the ground to the ocean, because while Japan was still digging through rubble in Kumamoto, a second and entirely unrelated hazard was building thousands of miles away in the open Pacific. On July 27th, a tropical depression over the central Pacific strengthened into Tropical Storm Dolphin, the 13th named storm of the 2026 Western Pacific typhoon season, named by Hong Kong in reference to the Chinese white dolphin native to its coastal waters. What happened next was almost unbelievably fast. Within roughly 3 days, Dolphin exploded from a tropical storm into a Category 5 super typhoon, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center estimating maximum sustained winds around 270 kilometers per hour, comparable to the strongest storms ever measured on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. According to meteorologists Jeff Masters and Bob Henson, who track global tropical cyclone activity closely, Dolphin became the planet's 5th Category 5 tropical cyclone of 2026. Putting this year ahead of the pace of 1997, the all-time global record year for Category 5 storms. Perhaps even more remarkable, Dolphin formed and intensified to super typhoon strength closer to the international dateline than any storm on record, an area of ocean not typically associated with producing storms this powerful. The storm's intensity has fluctuated as it churns westward. Chinese meteorological data placed its central pressure as low as 920 hectopascals on the morning of August 1st, with sustained winds near 60 meters per second at the core. For context, the lower the central pressure, the more powerful the storm's internal engine. As of the most recent forecasts, Dolphin was tracking west-northwest at 20 to 25 kilometers per hour, expected to pass south of mainland Japan near the Ryukyu Islands before entering the East China Sea. Forecasters at the Hong Kong Observatory say current guidance shows an elevated probability of the storm curving toward the East China Sea, with some models suggesting a possible landfall along China's Jiangsu-Shandong coastline in the days ahead, though the exact track remains genuinely uncertain, with prediction markets tracking the odds of a China landfall sitting close to a coin flip at the time of this recording. What is not uncertain is that Dolphin is already influencing weather far from its own center. In Hong Kong, forecasters say the typhoon's outer circulation is expected to trap hot, humid air over the city, driving very high temperatures in the days ahead, even without the storm making direct landfall there. This is now the second major typhoon-driven disruption to hit the region in a matter of weeks. Just days earlier, Typhoon Nul made landfall in Guangdong province as the strongest storm to strike China so far in 2026, prompting the evacuation of more than 20,000 people and forcing a temporary suspension of railway operations across the south. Ports across Fujian and southern China were still working through cargo backlogs from that storm when Dolphin began organizing behind it, meaning the region's shipping and emergency infrastructure is now facing a second consecutive stress test before fully recovering from the first. Now let's cross the Pacific entirely and head to the American West, because a third warning system, this one built specifically around fire, not water or shaking ground, is active right now across multiple states. The National Weather Service's Spokane office issued what it explicitly labeled a particularly dangerous situation. Red flag warning, the most serious tier of fire weather alert the agency issues, in effect from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening across the Okanagan Valley, the Colville Reservation, the Waterville Plateau, and the Columbia Basin region of eastern Washington. The warning cited wind gusts of 40 to 50 miles per hour, combined with relative humidity as low as 15%. A combination meteorologists describe as extreme fire weather because it allows any new ignition to spread explosively fast. Nearly identical red flag warnings were issued the same weekend across central and eastern Oregon, where the bench fire, burning southwest of Warm Springs, had already consumed more than 66,000 acres and was only 32% contained. Farther inland, the National Weather Service office in Glasgow, Montana, issued its own critical fire weather warning for the same weekend, while Utah's Wasatch Mountains and multiple surrounding fire weather zones were placed under red flag conditions as well, following a mandatory evacuation order in Logan, Utah, where a fast-moving wildland fire forced residents from their homes with less than an hour's notice late on a Friday night. The scale of what's already burning gives context to why this warning matters. The Kaiser Canyon fire in Okanagan County has grown past 129,000 acres. The Little Giant fire in Washington's Entiat Valley has forced evacuations after expanding to more than 25,000 acres. Nationwide, roughly 6 million acres had already burned by the time this warning was issued, with the bulk of that concentrated in Oregon and Washington, which together account for over 1.8 million of those acres. And critically, fire officials note that mid-July through mid-August is climatologically the driest stretch of the year in this region, meaning the red flag warning issued this weekend is arriving right at the seasonal peak of vulnerability, not before it or after it. Which brings us to the fourth and final warning, and this one is less about a single sudden event and more about a slow, sustained, continent-wide emergency. Europe is in the middle of what climate agencies are now calling its fourth major heat dome of the summer. According to the World Meteorological Organization, June 2026 was already the hottest June ever recorded for Western Europe, and the second warmest globally, driven in part by the highest sea surface temperatures ever recorded for that month. France recorded its hottest day in national history on June 24th, with a national average temperature of 30 degrees Celsius and a peak reading of 43.8 degrees Celsius in the western town of Plouau. That heat triggered France's highest level red alert across 58 departments, essentially the entire country, alongside warnings of an elevated wildfire risk driven by drought. Spain's Fabra Observatory in Barcelona, a station with more than a century of continuous weather records, recorded 45 degrees Celsius on July 8th, the highest temperature in its entire history. Now, meteorologists are warning that the pattern is repeating and intensifying heading into August. Forecast models are showing what's being described as a classic omega block, a weather pattern where a dome of high pressure sits locked over Central Europe with low pressure systems parked on either side, preventing the usual flow of cooler air from breaking up the heat. That pressure system is expected to pull exceptionally hot, dry air directly from the Sahara Desert into the heart of the continent, pushing temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius across a corridor stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in France through western Germany, the Benelux countries, Italy, Hungary, and the northern Balkans, with some areas forecast to approach 45 degrees. The World Meteorological Organization has specifically framed this as a test case for its early warnings for all initiative, emphasizing that heat health action plans, systems designed to alert vulnerable populations and mobilize medical resources before a heat wave peaks, are being activated across multiple countries in direct response to this pattern. So here we are, an earthquake and tsunami advisory in Japan, a record-setting super typhoon bearing down on East Asia, a particularly dangerous fire weather warning across the American West, a record heat dome locking in across Europe, all four active at essentially the same moment. It's natural to look at that list and wonder whether something has shifted, whether the planet is somehow more volatile right now than it normally is. So let's address that directly and honestly, because this is exactly the kind of moment that tends to generate more speculation than substance online. The geological events and the weather events on this list are not connected to each other in any physical sense. The Kumamoto earthquake was caused by stress accumulated along Japan's median tectonic line, a fault system that has nothing to do with typhoon formation in the open Pacific, wildfire risk in Washington state, or a high-pressure ridge sitting over France. These are independent systems governed by entirely different physical processes. Tectonic stress building over decades in one case, atmospheric pressure and ocean heat content in the others. What ties them together isn't a shared cause. It's shared timing and shared amplification from the same underlying seasonal and climatic backdrop. Here's what that backdrop actually looks like. Late July into August is climatologically the peak of several hazard seasons simultaneously, and that overlap happens every single year to some degree. It's the peak of the Western Pacific typhoon season, when ocean heat content is at its yearly maximum and most capable of fueling rapid intensification. It's the peak of the North American wildfire season, when vegetation across the western states has dried out the most after a full summer without significant rain. And it's the peak of the Northern Hemisphere's summer heat pattern, when heat domes are climatologically most likely to form and persist. Earthquakes don't follow a season. Kumamoto's timing this year is coincidental to the other three, but the other three genuinely do cluster here every year to some extent. What meteorologists and climate scientists are watching closely isn't whether these hazards occur simultaneously, because they often do. It's whether they're each hitting harder than the historical baseline. And on that specific question, the data does show real signal. 2026 is on pace to produce more Category 5 tropical cyclones globally than almost any year on record. Europe has now had 4 major heat domes in a single summer, an unusually high frequency. Wildfire acreage in the Pacific Northwest is already running well ahead of typical pace for this point in the season. Each of these individual hazards is arguably more intense than the historical average for this time of year, even though their simultaneous occurrence is a normal calendar overlap rather than some new global phenomenon. The practical takeaway is straightforward, and it's the same lesson every one of these situations demonstrates on its own. Early warning systems work, but only when people act on them immediately. In Kumamoto, the tsunami advisory was issued within 2 minutes of the quake and lifted once the actual wave threat was assessed as minor, which is exactly how these systems are designed to function. Fast initial caution followed by rapid refinement as better data comes in. In the Pacific, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center and Hong Kong Observatory are tracking Dolphin's uncertain path days in advance, specifically so that coastal communities in Japan, Taiwan, and China have time to prepare, regardless of exactly where it eventually turns. In the American West, a particularly dangerous situation designation exists specifically to communicate that this isn't a routine red flag day. It's a day to have an evacuation plan ready and to avoid any activity that could spark a fire, because conditions right now can turn a small ignition into an uncontrollable blaze within minutes. And across Europe, heat health action plans are being activated precisely because heat is one of the most underestimated killers among natural hazards, often causing more deaths quietly over days than a single dramatic event causes in an instant. If you live in any of the regions we covered today, the guidance is simple and specific to your situation. In Kyushu, stay alert for continued aftershocks and follow official Japanese government channels rather than unverified social media reports. Along the East Asian coast from Taiwan through the East China Sea, keep watching Dolphin's forecast track over the coming days, because the uncertainty in its path is real, and it could still shift toward multiple different coastlines. In the Pacific Northwest and Mountain West, treat any red flag warning during this window as serious, avoid outdoor burning or spark-producing activity entirely, and know your evacuation route before you need it. And across Europe, particularly for elderly residents or anyone without reliable access to cooling, take heat warnings seriously, stay hydrated, and check on vulnerable neighbors. Because heat doesn't announce itself the way an earthquake or a wildfire does. 4 warning systems, 4 different hazards, 1 overlapping window in time. That's not the planet suddenly behaving strangely. It's the planet doing what it does every year during this exact stretch of the calendar, just with several individual events pushing harder against their historical norms than usual. We'll keep tracking all 4 of these as they develop: the aftershock sequence in Kumamoto, Dolphin's eventual landfall, the fire situation across the American West, and how long this heat pattern holds over Europe. Subscribe so you don't miss the updates, and drop a comment letting me know if any of these 4 situations are happening near you right now. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.